It was an ordinary morning when I first noticed something strange about my Tesla Model X. I had parked it in my usual spot, right in front of my garage, where I'd parked it countless times before without issue. But this time, as I stepped out of the house, I found a handwritten note stuck under the windshield wiper. The note was from the HOA, warning me that my Tesla was not in compliance with the community's parking rules and that immediate action was required. At first, I was confused. My Model X was sleek, environmentally friendly, and fully street legal. The neighborhood covenants didn't specifically ban electric vehicles or Tesla models. So why was my car suddenly a problem? The note cited vague language about vehicle types and parking locations that were apparently prohibited. It was the kind of ambiguous rule that only existed to cause headaches for residents. I called the HOA office to ask for clarification, but their response was as frustrating as it was evasive. "We're enforcing community standards," they said, refusing to provide any written documentation or specific rule citations. The whole thing felt like a personal attack. As the police chief, I was no stranger to rules and regulations, but I also knew how to spot when enforcement was being misused for petty control. And this felt exactly like that. I decided to ignore the note for a day or two, hoping the issue would blow over. But that hope was short-lived. The next afternoon, I pulled into my driveway only to find a small crowd gathered near my garage. One of the neighbors, let's call her Karen, was there, looking displeased. To my shock, she had called 911, claiming that my Tesla was blocking access to the street and violating community safety rules. I approached calmly, introducing myself and explaining the situation. But Karen was having none of it. She insisted that the car was an obstruction, ignoring my explanation that it was parked perfectly legally on my own property. Minutes later, police officers arrived, unaware that the homeowner they were responding to was their very own police chief. The absurdity of the situation was almost comical, but underneath was a serious problem. The HOA was willing to weaponize emergency services to harass me. It was a misuse of community rules and public resources that needed to be addressed, and quickly. This was just the beginning of what would become a long, frustrating saga of HOA overreach, neighborhood politics, and standing up for my rights, both as a resident and as the police chief sworn to uphold justice. The morning after Karen's 911 call was anything but ordinary. I was still processing the sheer audacity of her complaint when I heard the familiar flashing lights pull up in front of my ranch-style home. Two patrol officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of professionalism and mild surprise when they realized who had called them. Being the police chief, I understand how emergency calls are handled, but having them dispatched against me over a parking dispute was surreal. The officers approached cautiously, and I greeted them cordially, emphasizing that I was happy to clear up any confusion. Karen, meanwhile, stood nearby with her arms crossed, repeating her claim that my Tesla was illegally blocking the street and posed a hazard. I calmly pointed out the facts. The Tesla was parked entirely within my property line, did not block the sidewalk or any emergency access, and complied with all local regulations and HOA guidelines as I understood them. The officers reviewed the HOA's complaint and inspected the scene. They confirmed what I had been saying all along. My car was parked legally and was not an obstruction. The call was ultimately deemed unfounded, and the officers left after explaining the situation to Karen, who was visibly irritated but said nothing further. While the incident was quickly resolved, it left a lingering feeling. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate attempt to escalate a petty grievance by invoking law enforcement. The HOA, or at least some of its more vocal members like Karen, had crossed a line by weaponizing the emergency system to create pressure. I knew I had to be careful. As police chief, I had to uphold the law impartially, and I didn't want this situation to devolve into a public spectacle or give my adversaries ammunition to claim favoritism. So I documented everything: the 911 call record, officers' notes, the HOA's previous warnings, and Karen's behavior. Transparency and evidence would be key in any future confrontation. Despite the professionalism of the responding officers, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. I started hearing whispers and seeing subtle signs of support and resistance among neighbors. Some clearly sided with the HOA, viewing my stance as defiance. Others quietly sympathized but feared retaliation. This event marked the start of an invisible war, a clash not just over parking, but over control, respect, and community dynamics. I was ready to stand my ground, but I knew the road ahead would be complicated, and I needed allies. The tension simmering after the 9/11 incident didn't dissipate. Instead, it escalated in subtle but unmistakable ways. A week after the police had cleared up the parking dispute, I woke up one morning to a new challenge. A large makeshift barricade had been placed directly in front of my garage door. It was an audacious move by the HOA, or more precisely, by certain overzealous members who seemed determined to make my life difficult. The barricade consisted of several orange traffic cones, wooden planks, and even a conspicuous "no parking" sign planted firmly in the ground. The message was clear. The HOA was trying to block me from accessing my own garage. The audacity of this action was staggering. At first I thought it was a prank, but it quickly became obvious it was intentional. I had never received any prior notice or explanation about the obstruction, nor was there any HOA rule permitting such interference on a homeowner's private driveway. The move was a blatant attempt to intimidate and harass. I documented the barricade immediately, taking photos and videos with timestamps. Then I contacted the HOA management, demanding they remove the obstruction at once. Their response was evasive, with vague statements about safety concerns and community compliance, but no concrete justification. This felt like an escalation of a war waged by bureaucracy rather than bullets. A power play intended to assert control over my property and send a message that defiance would have consequences. To add insult to injury, several neighbors approached, some offering quiet sympathy, others looking on with thinly veiled approval of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Despite the frustration and disruption, I remained calm. I knew that losing my temper or reacting impulsively would only feed into the narrative the HOA wanted to paint of me being difficult or abusing my authority as police chief. Instead, I leveraged my experience as a law enforcement leader to respond strategically. I contacted my legal counsel to assess any violations and began preparing a formal complaint for the HOA's board meeting. Additionally, I reached out to local government officials to inquire about regulations surrounding HOA actions and property access rights. Blocking a homeowner's access to their own property was not only unethical, it was illegal. The barricade wasn't just a physical barrier, it was symbolic of the growing battle over autonomy, respect, and the true role of an HOA in a community. Determined not to be intimidated, I knew my next steps would be crucial in setting the tone for the entire conflict. As the barricade incident unfolded, I realized that what I was facing was far more than a simple disagreement over parking or property lines. To truly understand the relentless pushback from the HOA and from Karen and her allies, I had to look behind the polished facades and official letters into the undercurrents driving their actions. My position as police chief gave me unique insight into organizational behavior and power dynamics, and I suspected this HOA was grappling with insecurities masked as authority. On the surface, the HOA claimed to be protecting community standards, but beneath that veneer was a hunger for control, control over property, control over neighbors, and control over the narrative. I began to attend HOA meetings, both the official sessions and the informal gatherings where decisions were often made in whispers. There, I witnessed a board dominated by a small clique, resistant to change, fearful of losing influence, and eager to demonstrate power through strict rule enforcement. Karen was a prominent voice, pushing for aggressive measures to set an example. Her actions, calling 911 over a legally parked Tesla, orchestrating the garage barricade, revealed a mindset that equated authority with dominance rather than fairness. Many of the other board members seemed reluctant participants, caught between loyalty to the status quo and discomfort with how far things had escalated. Behind closed doors, conversations were rife with talk about sending a message to residents who challenged the rules, and about the importance of maintaining order, often without clear reference to specific regulations. I also uncovered a history of selective enforcement. Some residents faced harsh penalties for minor infractions, while others were overlooked. This uneven application fostered resentment and division. Armed with this understanding, I realized that the battle wasn't just legal or procedural, it was cultural. The HOA's obsession with control was fueling a toxic environment that threatened the community's cohesion. I decided to shift my strategy from confrontation to engagement, building bridges where possible, shining light on inconsistencies, and rallying neighbors who felt similarly disempowered. I drafted a proposal for more transparent governance, including regular public reports, clear enforcement guidelines, and mechanisms for residents to appeal decisions fairly. I also started quietly gathering support among neighbors tired of arbitrary rules and heavy-handed tactics. The HOA's obsession with control was its weakness, and by exposing it, I hoped to reclaim not just my rights, but the community's soul. Navigating the delicate line between enforcing the law and being a neighbor was one of the toughest challenges I faced during the escalating conflict with the HOA. As the police chief, my role was clear: uphold justice impartially, protect the rights of all residents, and maintain public safety. But in this battle over my Tesla and garage access, I had to ensure that my authority wasn't seen as a weapon for personal gain or favoritism. From the outset, I was very conscious of perceptions. I knew that some HOA members and neighbors were watching closely, ready to accuse me of abusing my position. So I took steps to separate my official duties from this personal dispute. I recused myself from any law enforcement involvement related to HOA complaints or disputes, and encouraged my officers to handle any incidents independently. Transparency became my guiding principle. I openly documented all communications, shared evidence of the HOA's attempts to obstruct my property rights, and made sure that any interaction with the HOA was conducted through official channels, often involving legal counsel. This approach protected me from accusations of misconduct and kept the focus on the real issue: fairness. At the same time, I maintained my commitment to community safety and order. I addressed legitimate HOA concerns with professionalism and respect, while firmly pushing back against attempts to overreach or intimidate. One example was when a neighbor approached me, worried about traffic safety near my driveway. I listened carefully, reviewed the concerns, and proposed reasonable solutions that balanced safety with my right to access my garage freely. Meanwhile, I continued to meet with HOA leaders, advocating for dialogue over discord. I emphasized the importance of rules that are clear, consistent, and applied equally to all. Through all of this, I leaned on my years of experience in law enforcement, knowing when to stand firm and when to de-escalate. The battle wasn't just about a Tesla or a garage. It was about maintaining integrity, respecting boundaries, and ensuring that power wasn't abused by me or by the HOA. By standing firm without aggression, I earned respect from many neighbors, even some who had initially sided with the HOA. It reminded everyone that leadership isn't about control, it's about service and fairness. The fight was far from over, but I had established a foundation of trust and principle that would guide me through the next phases of this ongoing saga. After months of tension with the HOA and the high-profile incidents involving my Tesla and garage access, I began noticing a subtle but encouraging shift in the neighborhood. While some residents remained firmly in the HOA's camp, a growing number started to voice quiet support for my stance, and more importantly, for fairness and transparency in how the community was governed. It didn't happen overnight. Early on, many neighbors were hesitant to speak openly, fearing retaliation or social ostracism. HOA politics can be a sensitive subject, and in small communities, word travels fast, sometimes making people wary of getting involved. But small acts of solidarity began to surface. A neighbor would pause me on the street to express sympathy. Another would quietly ask for copies of the documents I was sharing. At local gatherings, conversations that once skirted the issue began to confront it directly, though still with caution. I decided to embrace this cautious support and turn it into something stronger. I organized informal meetings at my ranch, inviting neighbors to share their experiences and concerns about the HOA's enforcement practices. The turnout was modest at first, but those who attended were earnest and eager to be heard. Stories emerged of other residents who had faced similar arbitrary fines, strange rules, or bullying from the HOA board. This collective experience began to bond us. We formed what came to be called the Ranch Alliance, a loose coalition of residents advocating for fair treatment, clearer rules, and a more accountable HOA. Through the alliance, we drafted a community survey to anonymously gather input on HOA policies, and the results were telling. A majority expressed frustration with the lack of transparency, inconsistent enforcement, and perceived misuse of power. Armed with this grassroots support, I approached the next HOA meeting prepared to present these findings. I emphasized that the community was calling for change, not chaos, and that constructive cooperation was the path forward. Even some HOA board members, sensing the shifting mood, began to soften their stance. A few privately admitted that the board had overstepped in some areas. The growing neighbor support was not just political, it was personal. It reminded me why I was fighting. To protect not just my own rights, but the community's spirit and sense of belonging. While challenges remained, the Ranch Alliance gave us strength in numbers, a platform for our voices, and hope that fairness could prevail. With the growing support from neighbors through the Ranch Alliance and mounting evidence of the HOA's inconsistent and heavy-handed enforcement, it was clear the next phase of this battle would be fought in the legal arena. The barricade blocking my garage and the unwarranted complaints about my Tesla parking weren't just annoying, they were potential violations of property rights and local laws. It was time to bring in legal muscle. I contacted a seasoned real estate attorney familiar with HOA law, someone who had handled cases involving overreaching community associations. We began a thorough review of the HOA's bylaws, covenants, and past enforcement actions. It quickly became apparent that the HOA board had stretched their authority well beyond what the governing documents allowed. The HOA's vague and selectively enforced rules created loopholes they exploited to justify punitive measures against residents, including myself. But legal experts pointed out clear protections under state law for homeowners, particularly regarding access to their property and reasonable use of their land and vehicles. With counsel's guidance, I drafted formal cease and desist letters demanding the immediate removal of the barricade and a halt to any further harassment. The letters also requested that the HOA clarify their rules in writing and establish transparent enforcement procedures. Unsurprisingly, the HOA board pushed back, issuing counterclaims about community safety and property values. But they lacked legal backing. Their attempts to use vague rules to intimidate only strengthened our case. Parallel to this, the Ranch Alliance mobilized to support a petition demanding reforms and fair treatment. We also began exploring mediation as an alternative to protracted litigation, hoping to find a resolution that balanced community interests with individual rights. Throughout the process, I remained careful not to let my role as police chief influence the legal battle. All interactions with the HOA and the courts were handled through my attorneys, ensuring professionalism and fairness. The legal fight was draining, both emotionally and financially. But it was necessary. The HOA's overreach was a threat not only to me, but to every homeowner who valued their rights and dignity. The battle lines were drawn, and the courts would soon have to decide whether the HOA's power had limits. Yet, even amid the legal tangle, I held on to hope that reason and justice would prevail, and that this conflict could become a catalyst for positive change in our community. The day of the HOA board meeting was charged with tension. Months of behind-the-scenes conflicts, legal threats, and neighborhood whispers culminated in a confrontation that everyone knew was inevitable. I arrived early, parking my Tesla Model X, my symbol of both innovation and defiance, right where it had always belonged, in front of my garage. As I stepped onto the meeting grounds, I spotted Karen standing by the entrance, flanked by a few HOA board members and some supporters. Her expression was icy, her posture rigid, the very embodiment of the resistance I'd been fighting against. This was no longer about just a car or a garage. It was about respect, power, and community values. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but the atmosphere was anything but routine. When my name was called to present my case, I stood tall and clear, laying out the timeline of events. From the initial parking complaint to the illegal barricade, the 911 call, and the ongoing harassment. I presented documented evidence, including photos, legal opinions, and testimonies from neighbors who supported the Ranch Alliance's call for fair treatment and transparency. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of truth settling in. Karen, predictably, fired back with accusations of favoritism and abuse of authority, attempting to paint me as a bully, wielding my position as police chief to intimidate neighbors. But I had anticipated this and responded calmly, emphasizing my strict separation of law enforcement duties from personal matters and my commitment to fairness. The discussion grew heated, voices rising as board members debated whether to maintain their hardline stance or reconsider in light of the mounting evidence and community pressure. At one point, I suggested a compromise. Rescind the barricade, clearly define parking rules for everyone, including electric vehicles, and implement a transparent enforcement process with input from residents. Several board members, seeing the growing support for this approach, nodded in agreement. Karen's silence spoke volumes. After hours of debate, the board voted, unanimously, to remove the barricade immediately and to begin revising their rules with community participation. It was a decisive moment. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors came up to thank me quietly. Some apologized for previously siding with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Others expressed relief that fairness had finally won out. The showdown wasn't just a personal victory, it was a turning point for the entire community. That day, I realized that standing firm with facts, respect, and transparency could break down even the most entrenched resistance. The road ahead still held challenges, but this battle at the garage had restored a measure of trust and hope. After the HOA board meeting's decisive vote to remove the barricade and revise their enforcement policies, I felt a cautious sense of victory. The physical barriers were gone, but the emotional and psychological toll of the conflict lingered. It was time to focus on restoring order, not just to my property, but to my peace of mind and the community's fractured sense of trust. The very next day, the HOA arranged for the barricade materials to be dismantled and removed. Watching the last traffic cone and wooden plank taken away was oddly symbolic. It marked the end of one chapter, but also the beginning of healing. I took immediate steps to repair and secure my garage. Over the years, the constant stress had taken a toll on the upkeep of my property, so I invested in new locks, improved lighting, and even installed security cameras to prevent future harassment and document any incidents. More importantly, I opened the doors, figuratively and literally, to better communication. I invited neighbors over for casual gatherings by the ranch lake, shared updates about the HOA's policy revisions, and encouraged open dialogue about community concerns. Slowly, the neighborhood began to shift away from fear and suspicion toward cooperation. The Ranch Alliance evolved from a resistance group to a community advocacy committee, working with the HOA to ensure rules were fair, transparent, and enforced equally. I continued to attend HOA meetings, but now as a respected community member rather than a battleground opponent. Together, we drafted clearer guidelines on parking, property use, and dispute resolution, measures designed to prevent future conflicts. Personally, reclaiming my peace of mind was perhaps the hardest part. I turned to mindfulness practices and leaned on close friends and family for support. Serving as police chief taught me resilience, but this experience deepened my understanding of empathy and patience. Ultimately, this conflict reinforced a fundamental truth. Community is built not on power or control, but on mutual respect, fairness, and open communication. The struggle was difficult, but it strengthened my resolve to lead, not just by authority, but by example. Reflecting on the whirlwind of events, the HOA battles, the 911 calls, the barricades, and the legal fights, I realized that this experience was about much more than just defending my property or my rights as a police chief. It was a profound lesson in leadership, community, and the delicate balance between authority and humility. First and foremost, I learned that leadership isn't about asserting power over others. It's about listening, understanding different perspectives, and striving for fairness even when you have the upper hand. Wearing the badge gave me responsibility, but it didn't give me the right to impose will arbitrarily. True leadership demands accountability to the law, to your community, and to your own conscience. This saga taught me the importance of transparency and communication. Many conflicts with the HOA might have been avoided if rules were clear, processes fair, and residents engaged in open dialogue. When people feel heard and respected, they're more likely to cooperate rather than resist. I also discovered the power of community solidarity, the quiet support from neighbors, the formation of the Ranch Alliance, and the shared desire for change reminded me that no leader can succeed alone. Collective action, grounded in shared values, can challenge even entrenched systems. On a personal level, I learned resilience, how to maintain composure amid provocation, how to navigate conflicts without escalating them, and how to protect my peace of mind while standing firm. Perhaps most importantly, I saw that the role of police chief extends beyond enforcing laws. It encompasses being a role model, a mediator, and a guardian of community spirit. The HOA saga tested me in unexpected ways, but it also reaffirmed my commitment to serve with integrity and empathy. My ranch, my Tesla, my garage, they are symbols, yes, but more so they represent the principles I stand for. As I move forward, I carry these lessons with me, leading not just beyond the badge, but beyond titles and conflicts, toward building communities where respect, fairness and understanding thrive.